There are stories that exist on the very edge of our accepted reality. They aren't the ghost stories we whisper around a campfire, nor are they simple tales of monsters hiding in the dark. These are something else entirely. They are whispers of a reality adjacent to our own, a world governed by laws we are not meant to understand. These stories suggest that the solid, predictable world of history and physics, the world we are taught in Shulis, merely a thin veil. And sometimes, under the right kind of pressure, in the right place at the right time, that veil can be stretched, torn, and ripped wide open. These are the stories that tell us that humanity, in its relentless, often arrogant pursuit of knowledge and power, has occasionally stumbled upon secrets so profound and so dangerous that they had to be immediately and violently buried, locked away in the deepest, darkest vaults of official secrecy. Tonight, we are going to attempt to pry open one of those vaults. We are journeying back to a time of unprecedented global conflict, a time when the brightest minds on the planet were locked in a desperate, frantic race for technological supremacy. World War II. It was a crucible of innovation, a pressure cooker that gave us everything from radar and jet engines to the terrifying dawn of the nuclear age. In this frantic search for a war-winning superweapon, no idea was considered too strange, no theory too wild, no concept too far-fetched to be explored. The normal rules of scientific caution were cast aside in the name of survival. And this is where our story begins. It is a story that, if even a fraction of it is true, represents not just a secret military project, but a fundamental and violent violation of the laws of nature as we know them. It is the tale of a United States Navy warship that didn't just outsmart the enemy, but allegedly outsmarted reality itself. A ship that was rendered invisible, that teleported hundreds of miles in the blink of an eye, and that may have even been thrown through the very fabric of time. But this was no clean, sterile breakthrough. This was not a neat and tidy success story. The experiment, according to the legend, came at a horrific, unimaginable cost to the men on board, a cost so grotesque and so terrifying that it has been systematically denied and covered up for nearly 80 years. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Is it the most elaborate and chilling government conspiracy in American history? A secret so dark it has been protected by decades of silence, denial, and deliberate misdirection? Or is it one of the most persistent, detailed, and compelling urban legends of the 20th century? A phantom story born from a single, troubled mind and nurtured by our collective desire to believe in the impossible? Here, the lines between science fiction, documented history, speculative physics, time travel, and outright horror blur into an unsettling greenish fog. And at the center of that fog is a ship, a crew, and a terrible world-breaking secret. So prepare yourself. We are about to set sail into the heart of one of the most enduring and controversial mysteries of our time. It's a story that asks a terrifying question. What happens when we push science too far past its limits? And what becomes of the people who are caught in the blast when it all goes horribly, irrevocably wrong? To truly understand the bizarre, convoluted, and tangled web of the Philadelphia experiment, we can't start in a top-secret naval shipyard in 1943. That's where the event supposedly happened, but it's not where the story began. The story began more than a decade later, in the strange, paranoid, and optimistic landscape of 1950s America. And it starts with a man who was looking not at the sea, but at the sky. His name was Morris K. Jessup. It's important to understand that Morris Jessup was not a crackpot, not in the traditional sense. He was an educated, intelligent man, an astronomer with a master's degree from the prestigious University of Michigan. In his earlier career, he was a respected academic. He worked at the Lamont Hussey Observatory in South Africa and led expeditions to Mexico to study new binary stars. He was a man of science, of evidence, of observation. But Jessup's interests began to drift away from the mainstream. He became fascinated, and then obsessed, with the growing phenomenon of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. In the 1950s, UFOs were everywhere. Sightings like the one over Washington, D.C. in 1952, where mysterious lights buzzed the White House, had captured the public imagination. It was the atomic age, the space race was just beginning, and it felt like anything was possible. Jessup wanted to apply his scientific rigor to this new mystery. In 1955, he published a book that would change his life and ultimately end it. It was titled The Case for the UFO. In it, Jessup wasn't just cataloging sightings and telling spooky stories. He was trying to find a scientific explanation for how these craft could move in ways that defied our known laws of physics. He speculated that their propulsion systems might be based on some kind of anti-gravity, or more importantly, a highly advanced manipulation of electromagnetic fields. He believed that if we could understand Einstein's unified field theory, then hypothetical theory that would unite the forces of electromagnetism and gravity, we could build these machines ourselves. He was a serious man asking serious questions about a very fringe topic. The book sold modestly. It was not a runaway bestseller, but it brought Jessup to the attention of two very different, and very strange entities. The first and most baffling was the United States government itself. In the spring of 1957, Jessup received a shocking and unexpected letter from the Office of Naval Research, the ONR, in Washington, D.C. The ONR had received a package. It was a dog-eared, paperback copy of his own book, The Case for the UFO. It had been mailed to them anonymously in a manila envelope marked, Happy Easter. But this was no ordinary copy. The book was filled, from cover to cover, with sprawling, handwritten annotations in its margins. The notes were written in 3 different colors of ink: blue, green, and purple, suggesting 3 different authors or commentators were having a conversation with each other, and with Jessup's text. They discussed incredibly advanced physics, alien life forms, and technologies far beyond anything known to the public. They seemed to possess a deep, almost intimate knowledge of esoteric science. They referred to themselves as gypsies, spoke of mysterious ancient peoples they called LMs, and hinted that they were the descendants of an ancient spacefaring race. And buried within their strange, rambling, and often incoherent commentary was a direct reference to a secret naval experiment. An experiment where a ship and its crew were rendered completely invisible at sea. The ONR was, for reasons that have never been fully explained, utterly fascinated by these annotations. They didn't dismiss them as the ravings of madmen. They took them seriously. So seriously, in fact, that a private company with a government contract, the Vero Manufacturing Company of Texas, was commissioned to print a limited, private run of this annotated book. About 127 copies of what became known as the Vero edition were painstakingly produced and distributed within high-level naval intelligence circles. Think about that for a moment. An official government entity had taken the bizarre scribblings of anonymous figures in the margins of a UFO book and treated them as a document of profound importance, a potential intelligence brief. For Morris Jessup, this must have been both a shocking validation of his theories and a terrifying plunge down a very deep and very dark rabbit hole. But the ONR wasn't the only strange correspondence Jessup had received. This is where our story truly takes shape, where the seeds of the legend are planted. A year earlier, in January of 1956, after his book was first published, he got a letter from a man calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende. The letter was written in a similar, chaotic, rambling style to the Vero annotations, filled with bizarre capitalization, erratic punctuation, and a sense of breathless urgency. Allende claimed that he had read Jessup's book and that Jessup was on the right track about electromagnetic fields being the key to UFO propulsion. But he said Jessup didn't know the half of it. He said the U.S. Navy had already proven his theories correct, over a decade earlier. Allende claimed to have been a direct eyewitness to a secret military experiment of such power and horror that it proved everything Jessup had been theorizing about. He said that in late October of 1943, he was serving as a deckhand on a merchant marine ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, which was docked in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. From the deck of his ship, he claimed he watched a nearby destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, become the subject of this terrifying experiment. He described it in vivid, chilling detail. First, he said, a strange, greenish, shimmering fog began to swirl around the Eldridge, slowly obscuring it from view. He was specific that this was not smoke or mist from a generator. He described it as a greenish, fiery, and misty-looking light that seemed to hum with energy. Then, the fog itself seemed to solidify, creating a shimmering field of force around the ship. And then, the impossible happened. The USS Eldridge, a 1,200-ton vessel of solid steel, vanished. It was gone. Not just hidden by the fog, but its distinct outline against the water and the sky was completely gone. All that remained, he claimed, was its sharp impression in the water, the empty space where a 300-foot warship should have been. Allende claimed the ship was rendered completely invisible to the naked eye. He wrote to Jessup, his strange syntax adding to the otherworldly feel of the account. The results were complete invisibility of a ship, destroyer type, and all of its crew while at sea. October 1943. He went on to say that this field of invisibility extended for about 100 yards out from the ship in all directions. He described an unsettling physical sensation for anyone who got too close. A sickening, wrapping, snatching, pushing, pulling, pressure. Jessup, the scientist, was intrigued but deeply skeptical. This was an extraordinary claim, and it came from a man who sounded unstable. He wrote back to Allende, treating him cautiously, asking for more details, for proof, for anything to corroborate this wild tale. Allende's response, when it finally came months later, only deepened the mystery and added a new, even more fantastic layer to the story. He now gave his return address as simply Carl M. Allen. A slight but significant change. In this new letter, he revealed the most shocking part of the Philadelphia experiment. It wasn't just about invisibility. Allende, or Allen, claimed that while the USS Eldridge was invisible in Philadelphia, It had been seen for a period of several minutes at a naval dock in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. The ship had teleported. It had dematerialized from one location and rematerialized in another, only to vanish again from Norfolk and reappear, minutes later, back in the Philadelphia shipyard. This was not just a violation of physics. It was a complete shattering of it. The experiment had apparently involved not just invisibility, but instantaneous spatial displacement. This was the stuff of science fiction, and Alan claimed to have seen it with his own eyes. But it was the human cost that transformed the story from a science fiction marvel into a tale of absolute body horror. According to Alan, the effect of this dematerialization on the crew was catastrophic. When the ship finally and fully returned to Philadelphia, the men on board were in a state of profound physical and psychological trauma. Some were simply gone, having never rematerialized at all, vanished into nothingness. Some were driven stark raving mad, their minds shattered by the experience. But the worst fates were reserved for the others. Alan described men who had become stuck in the very structure of the ship. He claimed to have seen one man walk straight through a steel bulkhead as if it were water, only to never be seen again. More horrifically, he claimed that several sailors were found fused into the steel of the ship itself, half in, half out of the metal, alive and screaming in agony. 2 sailors, he said, were found embedded in the steel, one in the deck and one in a bulkhead, and the Navy, unable to separate them from the ship, could do nothing but watch them die. And then there was the bizarre and terrifying phenomenon he called the freeze. Alan described a lingering side effect where crew members who survived the initial experiment would seemingly get stuck in time. A man could be at home with his family, years later, and then suddenly, without warning, he would freeze, becoming invisible and intangible, unable to be seen, heard, or touched by anyone. Alan called this getting stuck in the molasses, or going into the deep freeze. He told a story of 2 sailors who got into a bar fight after the experiment, and in the middle of it, simply vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. Perhaps the most gruesome side effect he described was spontaneous combustion. He claimed one sailor was sitting at home with his family when he suddenly burst into flames. The fire, Alan claimed, was impossible to extinguish, and he burned for 18 days. This was the unbelievable, horrifying story that Morris Jessup now found himself entangled in. On one hand, it was the ultimate proof for his theories about UFO propulsion. On the other, it was the incoherent rambling of a man who seemed to be deeply unstable. Jessup tried to investigate through official channels. He looked into the public records. He found that the USS Eldridge D-173 was indeed a real ship, commissioned in the summer of 1943. But the Navy's official logs, the ship's own war diary, showed that the vessel was not in Philadelphia on the date of the alleged experiment. According to them, it was commissioned in New York and then on its shakedown cruise in the waters around the Bahamas. A direct contradiction. Jessup found himself at a dead end. His career was in decline. His publisher rejected his next book proposal. His wife left him. He became increasingly despondent and paranoid, yet he couldn't let the story go. He was convinced he was on the verge of a world-changing discovery but was completely unable to prove it. He told friends he felt he was being watched, that powerful forces were working against him, trying to shut him up. On the evening of April 20th, 1959, Morris K. Jessup drove his station wagon to Matheson Hammock Park in Miami, Florida. He attached a hose from the car's exhaust pipe to the passenger side window and turned on the engine. The next morning, he was found dead. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide. He had been despondent over his personal and professional failures. The case seemed closed. But for those who believed in the Philadelphia experiment, this was the final, damning piece of evidence. Jessup hadn't killed himself. He had been silenced. He had gotten too close to the truth behind the ultimate government conspiracy, and he had paid the ultimate price. His death transformed the story from a fringe theory into a martyr's legend. Carl Allen, the man who had started it all, faded back into obscurity, leaving behind a handful of bizarre letters that had sparked one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. After Jessup's death, the story of the Philadelphia experiment went underground. It was kept alive in the small, insular communities of UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists who saw the Vero edition as a kind of sacred text, a piece of suppressed knowledge. For nearly 2 decades, it remained a niche urban legend, a bizarre footnote in the annals of paranormal lore. That all changed in 1979 with the publication of a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. It was written by Charles Berlitz, the same author whose book on the Bermuda Triangle had turned a collection of maritime disappearances into a global phenomenon. Berlitz, co-authoring with a UFO researcher named William L. Moore, took Jessup's story, dusted it off, and blew it wide open for a mainstream audience. The book presented Carl Allen's letters as established fact and added new, unverified eyewitness accounts from anonymous sources. It was a sensation, a runaway bestseller that sat on bookshelves next to thrillers and romance novels. Then, in 1984, Hollywood came calling. A science fiction movie, also called The Philadelphia Experiment, was released. The movie, a classic piece of 80s sci-fi, introduced its own dramatic flair. It solidified the time travel aspect of the legend in the public's imagination, featuring two sailors from the Eldridge who jump overboard during the experiment and are thrown through a time vortex, landing in the desert of 1984. The story was now firmly embedded in popular culture. It was no longer a fringe belief, it was a modern American myth as well known as Roswell or Bigfoot. But as the story grew in fame, it also attracted more scrutiny. And this is where the legend bifurcates, splitting into two distinct narratives. One is the story of the believers, who began to add even more incredible layers to the tale. And the other is the story of the skeptics, who began to systematically dismantle it, piece by piece. Let's first follow the believers further down the rabbit hole, because the story was about to get even stranger. In the late 1980s, a man named Albilek came forward with the most astonishing claim of all. He claimed he was one of those sailors who jumped off the USS Eldridge. Albilek claimed that he was, in fact, a man named Edward Cameron, born in 1916. He said he and his brother, Duncan Cameron, were both physicists assigned to the project. When the experiment went horribly wrong and the ship became unstable, he and Duncan jumped overboard. But they didn't land in the waters of the Philadelphia shipyard. According to Bilek's incredible story, they were thrown through time, landing in the year 1983 at a top-secret military base at Montauk Point, Long Island, the site of another famous conspiracy theory, the Montauk Project, which was supposedly a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment's research into teleportation and time travel. Bilek claimed that there, in the future, he met the famous mathematician John von Neumann, who was somehow still alive and running the project. He was told that the experiment in 1943 had ripped a hole in space-time, and they needed him to go back and shut it down. Bilek claimed he was sent back in time, destroyed the ship's equipment, and then returned to 1983. But the story doesn't end there. He claimed the government could not simply return him to his own time. So, they did something even more sinister. They used advanced technology to de-age him, send him back to be born again as Albilek to a new family, and used psychological and technological means to wipe his memory completely. He lived a normal, unassuming life until the 1980s, when he saw the movie The Philadelphia Experiment. He claimed watching the film began to trigger flashes of memory, and through controversial memory recovery techniques, he slowly pieced together his real past as Edward Cameron. Albilek became a star on the conspiracy theory circuit. His story was a sprawling epic, connecting the Philadelphia Experiment to the Montauk Project, secret Nazi technology, and alien treaties. It was the ultimate government conspiracy narrative, a tale of suppressed science and stolen lives. For believers, Albilek was the smoking gun, a living witness who could describe the technology, the people involved, and the horrific consequences firsthand. But while Bilek was telling his story, a different group of researchers were meticulously picking apart the original legend. And what they found was a foundation built not on solid evidence, but on shifting sand and tragic misunderstanding. Let's start with the ship itself, the USS Eldridge. The testimony of the men who actually served on it became a crucial point of contention. In 1999, at a reunion for the veterans of the USS Eldridge in Atlantic City, the surviving crew members were interviewed by journalists. Their answer was unanimous, unequivocal, and frustrated. The Philadelphia Experiment never happened. They called the story a complete fabrication, an insulting work of fiction. They had never been to Philadelphia during that time period. They had never had crew members fused to the deck. They had never seen a green fog or vanished into thin air. One veteran, Ed Dudgeon, who served on the ship as an electrician's mate, said flatly, "I think it's a bunch of malarkey. A lot of guys got a big charge out of it, a big laugh." They were old men, bemused and a little annoyed that their real wartime service had been overshadowed by a science fiction story. So what about the supposed teleportation to Norfolk? If the ship wasn't in Philadelphia, how could it have teleported from there? Skeptics found a plausible, if mundane, explanation for this part of the story, too. There is a series of inland waterways, the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, that connects the Delaware Bay near Philadelphia to the Chesapeake Bay near Norfolk. A ship using this canal could travel between the two ports in a matter of hours, far faster than taking the long, open ocean route. To sailors on another ship who weren't aware of the shortcut, a vessel that left Philadelphia one evening and was then seen in Norfolk the next morning might appear to have traveled an impossible distance in a short amount of time. It wasn't teleportation, it was just geography. So where did the core of the story, the invisibility, the green fog, the strange effects on people come from? If the crew says it didn't happen, and the ship's logs say it couldn't have happened, what was Carl Allen actually talking about? The answer, most skeptics agree, lies in a real but far less sensational piece of top-secret naval technology. During World War II, the Navy was indeed conducting highly classified experiments in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. But they weren't trying to achieve literal optical invisibility. They were trying to achieve magnetic invisibility. One of the biggest threats to Allied shipping was the German Navy's use of highly effective magnetic torpedoes and mines. These weapons didn't need to hit a ship directly. They would detonate when they detected the large magnetic field that any massive steel ship naturally projects. The Navy's countermeasure was a process called degaussing. Degaussing involved wrapping the entire hull of a ship in a network of thick, heavy-duty electrical cables. A powerful electric current was then run through these cables. This created an opposing electromagnetic field that effectively canceled out the ship's own magnetic signature, making it invisible to these magnetic weapons. It was a vital, war-winning technology. And from a distance, a ship undergoing a degaussing procedure, wrapped in massive cables with powerful generators humming and sparking on its deck, might have looked very strange and mysterious to an uninformed observer. The green fog could also have a simple explanation. Some have speculated that the powerful electromagnetic fields generated by degaussing equipment could have caused a well-known weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. This occurs when a sharp or pointed object in a strong electric field ionizes the air around it, creating a luminous plasma. It often appears as a faint, eerie, greenish-blue glow that dances along masts and railings. A real, observable phenomenon that could easily be misinterpreted as something otherworldly. This brings us back to the source of it all. The man known as Carlos Allende or Carl Allen. Researchers eventually tracked him down. His full name was Carl Meredith Allen, and his life story was a sad and troubled one. He was a drifter, a man with a documented history of mental health issues who spent much of his life wandering the country. He was known by his family to be highly intelligent and a voracious reader, but also eccentric and prone to making up elaborate stories. He had a penchant for writing bizarre, annotated letters to authors and scientists. The Vero annotations were almost certainly his work and his alone. The 3 different colors of ink were likely just him, writing at different times to create the illusion of a conversation with imaginary, enlightened beings. In 1986, years after the legend had taken hold, Carl Allen himself seemingly confessed. In an interview, he admitted that the entire Philadelphia experiment story was a hoax, something he had invented after reading Jessup's book and mixing it with conversations he'd overheard and things he'd seen while serving in the Merchant Marines. He had created a fantasy, and to his utter astonishment, the world, including the U.S. Navy, had taken him seriously. Case closed, right? A tragic misunderstanding, fueled by a troubled but creative mind, that led to the creation of a powerful urban legend. That is the rational, evidence-based conclusion. But for believers, it's never that simple. They argue that the Navy's denial is exactly what you'd expect from a government conspiracy. Of course they would deny it. Of course they would produce falsified ship's logs. Of course they would discredit the key witness by painting him as mentally unstable. And as for Carl Allen's confession, believers claim he was pressured into recanting his story by government agents, or that he deliberately created a hoax confession to throw them off his trail. And to be fair, Allen's own story was never consistent. At other times, he recanted his recantation, once again claiming the story was absolutely true. He was a man whose own narrative was as unstable as the teleporting ship he described. So here we are, left standing at a fork in the road, with 2 very different paths leading from the same set of strange events. The evidence trail splits, and we are forced to choose which narrative to follow. Path 1 is the path of reason, of science, of skepticism. It tells a story of coincidence and tragedy. A UFO researcher named Morris Jessup, fascinated by fringe science, writes a speculative book. A troubled but highly creative drifter named Carl Allen reads it and, in a flash of inspiration or delusion, concocts a fantastic story based on a misunderstanding of a real but mundane naval procedure, degaussing. He sends his story to Jessup, who, at a low point in his life, becomes obsessed. The U.S. Navy, in a moment of Cold War paranoia where any potential technological edge was worth investigating, becomes inexplicably interested in Allen's ramblings, further fueling Jessup's obsession and paranoia. Ultimately, the weight of it all becomes too much for Jessup, and he takes his own life. Decades later, his story, amplified by books and movies and even more elaborate eyewitnesses, like Albilek, becomes one of the great urban legends of our to me a powerful testament to the power of a good story to completely overshadow a mundane truth. Path 2 is the path of conspiracy, of shadow and secrets. It tells a much darker, more profound story. In a desperate race to win the war, the U.S. government, perhaps with the help of legendary scientists like Albert Einstein and his unified field theory, unlocked a terrible and powerful secret of the universe. They found a way to bend light, to fold space, to tear the very fabric of reality. Their test subject was the USS Eldridge and its unwilling crew. The Philadelphia experiment was a success, but a catastrophic one. The results were so horrifying, the human cost so great, that the project was immediately and violently buried. The evidence was destroyed, the records were faked, and anyone who knew too much, like Morris Jessup, was silenced. Carl Allen was a lone voice crying in the wilderness, a witness to an event so traumatizing that it shattered his mind, leaving him unable to tell his story in a way the world would believe. The story survives today only as a whispered rumor, a government conspiracy so profound that it makes us question the very nature of the world around us. So which path is the truth? Was the Philadelphia experiment a hoax or a horror? A fantasy or a suppressed fact? The incredible persistence of this story tells us something profound about ourselves. We are fascinated by the idea of secret knowledge. We are drawn to the belief that just beyond our sight, powerful forces are at play, shaping our world in ways we can't comprehend. The Philadelphia experiment is the ultimate manifestation of that belief. It combines all the elements of a perfect modern myth: a top-secret military project, misunderstood science, a lone, heroic whistleblower, a tragic, martyred investigator, and a powerful, shadowy government hiding the awful truth. It taps into our deep-seated fear of unchecked authority and our simultaneous awe at the boundless mysteries of the universe. It's a timeless story about the dangers of flying too close to the sun, of humanity trying to play God. And now, I want to know what you think. Where do you stand on this enduring, intractable mystery? Do you believe the rational explanation of degaussing and a troubled man's fantasy? Or do you think there's a kernel of truth to the story, a secret that the government is still hiding to this day? Was Carl Allen a fabulist, or was he a witness? And what about Al Bielek? Was he a con man, or was he the living proof of time travel? Let me know your theories, your ideas, and your own perspective on this incredible story in the comments below. If you enjoy these deep dives into the gray areas of history and science, into the legends that simply refuse to die, then please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. There are so many more stories out there, waiting in the shadows to be told. In the end, whether the USS Eldridge ever actually vanished from Philadelphia Harbor or not, the story of the Philadelphia experiment has proven to be very real. It has survived for nearly a century, a ghost ship sailing on a sea of rumor and speculation, forever caught between fact and fiction, between a strange green glow and the deep darkness of a government secret. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful and enduring things in the world aren't weapons or technologies, but the stories we choose to believe. Thank you for listening. Stay curious and never stop questioning the official story.